Barron Trump stood on the balcony of a modest civic center in the heart of a once prosperous small city. Below, in the leafy square and the narrow streets, a crowd had begun to gather, city officials in pressed suits, local business owners with anxious faces, and community leaders who wore that mix of hope and tension. A gentle breeze carried a distant smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, reminding him that life continued in small, comforting rhythms even when communities faced uncertainty. In the weeks leading up to this day, the city had been gripped by contention over a development project that some believed could either save them from decline or bury them in further debt. They had invited Barron Trump, known for his quiet approach to leadership, to help mediate the crisis. He could see them slowly filing into the courtyard, parents with children, college students looking determined, older folks in neat attire, all curious about what was about to unfold. Some had come out of admiration for his methods, others out of skepticism. After all, was it possible that a soft-spoken figure could navigate the storm of local politics? Often, the story of a town in decline is one of lost businesses, decaying buildings, and hollow promises from politicians who come and go. But this time, they hoped, might be different. They expected someone powerful or domineering to step forward. Instead, they got Barron, the man whose public persona was about thoughtful silence and measured words. It was rumored that he spent more time listening than speaking, which some found intriguing, and others saw as suspicious. Inside the Civic Center's auditorium, folding chairs had been arranged in concentric arcs around a wide wooden podium. Dust motes drifted through beams of late afternoon light, giving the space a slightly nostalgic feel. Rows of flags lined the walls, symbols of the city's better days and unforgotten ideals. At the back, local news crews tested microphones and adjusted cameras. A slight air of anticipation built as people settled into seats, shuffling papers and murmuring to one another in low voices. Barron walked in quietly, accompanied only by his longtime associate, Lyle, and a young city liaison who had introduced herself as Nadine. She wore a crisp blouse and carried a folder stuffed with data about the city's finances, job market, and the controversial proposal that had ignited so much debate. Nadine was the one who had made the bold request for Barron to come. She believed that the city needed a mediator who cared more about hearing every side than about making headlines with grand speeches. If Barron was the man who once redefined a national conversation through quiet resolve, maybe he could help them now. The stage at the front was empty except for a microphone and a few chairs set in a semicircle. The plan was for Barron to moderate a town hall where different stakeholders could voice concerns, propose ideas, or simply vent frustrations. The development project in question involved building a sprawling commercial complex on the outskirts of town, funded by an external corporation with a track record of prioritizing its bottom line. Some believed it would create jobs and revive the local economy, others feared it would demolish the region's culture, displace families, and leave the city on the hook for infrastructure costs if the plan failed. Rumors swirled, shady deals, political bribes, hidden agendas. In short, the kind of conflict that typically led to screaming matches and stalemates, not solutions. Barron approached the microphone, scanning the crowd. He saw anxious faces, folded arms, some skeptical glances. Unlike a typical meeting, there was no immediate barrage of speeches. He cleared his throat gently, his voice soft but carrying enough that people leaned forward to listen. "Thank you all for being here. I won't pretend I have your answers. I came to listen, to each of you, to every side of this story. When we allow ourselves to hear beyond our own assumptions, we often find truths we never expected." He paused, letting the hush grow. Some in the audience exchanged uncertain looks. Usually, a guest speaker would begin with a strong pitch, a rousing statement, or an attempt to rally. Barron's introduction, with its understated sincerity, felt both refreshing and disarming. A few people gave tentative claps. Lyle, standing off to the side, wore that familiar expression of trust in Barron's approach. "I'm told many of you feel strongly about this development," Barron went on, nodding politely to a group of local activists in the front row. "Some believe it's a lifeline, some believe it's a threat. Perhaps most of you feel it's both." Let's talk about it honestly and openly. My role here is to help us focus on hearing each other, not to feed more noise." He stepped away from the mic, inviting people to come forward one by one. The air in the auditorium had that charged quality that arises when ordinary folks prepare to speak their truth. First was a business owner, a middle-aged woman with the posture of someone who had been fighting long battles. She introduced herself as Carla, the proprietor of a small manufacturing plant that had once employed dozens. "I've laid off more people than I want to remember," she said, her voice trembling. "If this development means new business, new customers, I can hire some of them back. My staff's families depend on us finding real solutions. So yeah, I support the plan." Barron watched her intently, nodding as she spoke. He asked a few short, clarifying questions in that calm way of his, never interrupting or dominating. Carla's words had the ring of desperation but also hope. She gazed at Barron, expecting him to weigh in, but he simply thanked her for sharing and gestured for the next speaker to come forward. An older man, stooped with age but with bright, fiery eyes, approached the mic. "James," he said curtly. "Been in this city my entire life. This plan," he gestured toward a thick packet of documents he carried, "is a quick fix that'll rip away the identity of our town. We've got farmland at risk, and that corporate developer doesn't care about local heritage. They'll pave over our fields, build big chain stores, then vanish when profits dip. That's what they've done elsewhere." James, too, looked at Barron for a reaction. But instead of launching into a rebuttal, Barron asked gently, "What would you propose as an alternative, if anything?" The old man exhaled, some of the fight leaving his eyes at being asked his opinion. "We need smaller-scale growth," he replied. "Support local businesses, invest in roads for farmland distribution, maybe create a modest trade hub that doesn't overshadow local shops." But no one listens. They want a big show. This pattern repeated as the town hall progressed. A young mother worried about the environmental cost, a local teacher insisted the tax revenue might bolster schools, a small farmer described how expansion had ruined other rural towns. Each speaker carried a piece of the puzzle, each with convictions shaped by personal experience. And Barron? He rarely made statements, mostly letting them speak, occasionally asking a question that pried deeper into their motivations. "How would you see the revenue helping your district? Are there protections we can build into any contract to safeguard farmland?" He didn't posture or pretend to have the answers. He just listened, his face calm, his posture open, his voice subdued. The audience, initially restless, found themselves leaning in, compelled by the dynamic that was emerging. Without the usual shouting or posturing, people began to realize that their words mattered. Soon, a municipal official took the mic to explain how the city's finances had declined and that they needed a major boost to avoid fiscal catastrophe. Another speaker, a young activist with bright eyes and a restless energy, criticized the entire system that pinned hopes on external corporations. A local reporter took notes furiously, her eyebrows raised at how civil the conversation remained. Even those who disagreed profoundly felt compelled to listen. Barron occasionally offered short reflections, never overshadowing the participants but helping them see connections. When someone would mention farmland concerns, he gently directed the city official to confirm how farmland was zoned. When concerns about tax breaks arose, he prompted a local economist to present data on the cost-benefit ratio. His tone was always even, always patient, as though the whole city had time to unpack every angle rather than rush to an explosive verdict. None of the typical drama or meltdown was happening, despite the tension that had festered for months. That first session lasted hours, well into the evening. The crowd size ebbed and flowed, with some going home to tend to families and others arriving later. Through it all, Barron remained, calmly presiding over the evolving dialogue. By the end, an odd sense of relief fell over the auditorium, like a collective exhale after so many had unburdened their fears and desires. As the final speaker, an environmental consultant, stepped away from the mic, a hush filled the space. People looked at Barron, uncertain what came next. He offered a faint, appreciative smile. "Thank you for sharing your stories. This was never about me telling you what to do. It was about hearing each other. Perhaps now we have a foundation to build on. Tomorrow, if you're willing, let's gather again and see what common ground can be found. Because truly, until we listen, we can't solve anything." The meeting adjourned with polite applause, not thunderous, but meaningful. People lingered, conversing in smaller circles, discussing the points raised. Over the next few days, the auditorium became a hub of repeated sessions. Barron was present at each, often quietly seated among them, encouraging participants to speak, occasionally bridging misunderstandings with a pointed question or a calm rephrasing. In typical gatherings, arguments would have escalated, voices would have been raised in frustration. But here, it seemed the community had accepted a new social contract, to let each other speak without interruption, to respond only after reflection. Through this spirit, the question was no longer, "Are you for or against the development?" but "What specific terms might protect farmland while enabling growth? How can local shops thrive if large chains arrive?" As days turned into a week, an informal committee coalesced, a blend of city council members, business owners, farmers, and activists. They pored over details, hammered out suggestions, and returned nightly to share progress. Barron guided them with a practiced subtlety, ensuring voices not typically heard had their say. He insisted that each major faction designate a liaison to present their concerns systematically. Those liaisons learned to respond to questions in calm, thorough statements. The tension in the room subsided, replaced by a cautious optimism. Word spread through the region about this art of listening that Barron Trump had brought to a fractious city. Nearby towns with their own disputes began inquiring about how he facilitated such civility. The press, initially expecting either fireworks or a meaningless outcome, reported that a constructive conversation was actually taking place. Headlines read, "Trump's quiet methods calm a divided town," or "The city that talked itself to understanding." Some articles praised him as a mediator whose superpower was restraint, others questioned whether the approach could scale to bigger crises. All the while, Barron maintained his understated presence. Often, after daily sessions, he'd stand by an exit door, shaking hands, asking individuals personally how they felt. He took notes in a small journal, capturing ideas that might otherwise be lost in the shuffle. He never demanded to take credit for progress. Instead, he reminded them that the credit belonged to the community. He was, in essence, a catalyst, providing an environment where the city could mend itself. By the 10th day, a remarkable sense of unity emerged that no one had foreseen. At a final public forum, the committee presented a draft plan. They would consider a scaled-down version of the development, one that set aside significant acreage for farmland, guaranteed local retailers space in prime lots, and required the corporation to invest in local infrastructure like roads and public transport. The city's council found themselves drafting legal frameworks that mirrored the community's newly discovered synergy. Disagreements persisted, of course. This was no fairy tale transformation. But the tone had changed from destructive confrontation to measured compromise. People recognized each other's humanity behind the stances. That final night, the auditorium glowed with a subdued, solemn energy. Over 100 citizens gathered to hear the proposed agreement. Barron, seated in the audience this time, listened attentively as the committee members took turns summarizing the provisions. Some speakers choked up, recalling how hopeless everything felt just a couple of weeks prior. They thanked him by name, turning to gesture at him in the crowd, crediting him for teaching them to truly hear one another. He responded with humble nods, never making it about himself. He insisted that the city had done the hardest work, committing to an open dialogue. When the last speaker concluded, an almost reverent silence wrapped the auditorium. Eventually, it broke into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling as more people joined. Some wept, clutching neighbors and shaking hands with individuals they once viewed as opponents. On stage, the committee declared that while they still had steps to finalize, they had laid a foundation for a development plan shaped by local needs rather than corporate dictates. The sense of relief, pride, and renewed faith in communal power was palpable. Barron rose from his seat, and the crowd quieted. He ascended the stage and took the microphone, gazing at the faces below. This was the moment they seemed to want from him, a summary, a benediction of sorts. Yet he said little. "I'm humbled by what you've accomplished. My role was simply to remind us all that listening is not weakness, it's the gateway to understanding. You discovered, together, that solutions arise when we respect every voice. And truly, that's all any community needs to unlock its collective potential." He paused, meeting the gazes of Carla, James, the municipal official who had pushed for the project, the young activist who had once accused the system of apathy, and so many others. "If you can leave this place with one lasting lesson," he concluded softly, "let it be that the quietest voice can hold the greatest wisdom, if we let it be heard." The applause returned, more intense, carrying gratitude rather than mere politeness. People thronged around him afterward, wanting to express thanks, to share personal anecdotes, or to seek his advice on personal or professional dilemmas. He stayed, patient, offering a kind ear to each question or story. Then, when the hall finally emptied out near midnight, he slipped away with Lyle, stepping into the cool night air. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and a soft wind carried echoes of laughter and relief from the day's achievements. Walking quietly beside Lyle, Barron reflected on everything. This journey was never about him dictating a solution, it was about revealing the community's capacity to shape their destiny. They had found that capacity through the deceptively simple yet profound act of listening. If anything, he left with a renewed sense that the greatest gift one can give is a space for voices to be heard in earnest. He had seen once more how empathy, forged in silence and respect, could heal wounds that anger only inflamed. In the morning, local news headlines ran stories with titles like, "City Breaks Deadlock Through Calm Mediation," mentioning how the presence of Barron Trump had fostered a spirit of collaboration. Online, comments ranged from awe at the city's transformation to incredulity. Could it really be that simple? People argued whether it was a fluke, a one-off triumph, or if the model might be replicable in larger-scale conflicts. Yet the individuals who lived it knew the answer. It worked because they chose to lay down their walls and speak without drowning each other out. Barron's departure was as unassuming as his arrival. He didn't stay for victory parades or public ceremonies. The city offered him a small token of gratitude, a plaque embossed with the words, "In thankfulness for renewed understanding." He accepted it with a smile, telling them he hoped they kept listening, that the real measure of success would be how they continued caring for each other after he was gone. On the drive away, Lyle commented how extraordinary it was to witness such a transformation in just a couple of weeks. "I can't recall the last time I saw a community pivot from near chaos to cohesive planning so gracefully," he remarked. Barron leaned his head back against the car seat, watching the scenery flash by, quaint storefronts, tree-lined avenues, families strolling on sidewalks. "It was always within them," he said quietly, just waiting for someone to give them permission to slow down and hear each other. Lyle nodded thoughtfully. "If only more places embraced that. People are so quick to talk, to argue, to defend themselves, they forget to actually listen." Barron's expression remained serene. "Precisely. But the art of listening, once rediscovered, can become the strongest tool for bridging any gap. That might be the most important skill I can pass on to those who seek my help." In the months that followed, the city continued refining its development plan, ironing out details with the external corporation now forced to adopt far more community-friendly terms. A year later, the new construction began under careful oversight, and local retailers thrived instead of being overshadowed. A new sense of unity permeated the once divided neighborhoods, and many credited the foundation of open forums and calm discussions that Barron had seeded. He received occasional updates, letters describing how farmland was preserved alongside modern commercial space, how local taxes rose modestly but stabilized vital services, and how old adversaries now greeted each other as partners rather than foes. The story of that city circulated across civic communities and political circles, inspiring others to experiment with similar listening sessions. Some worked well, others struggled against entrenched distrust. Yet the spark had been lit, exemplifying that no matter how loud or polarized a conflict might be, the path to mutual respect and viable solutions often starts with a willingness to hear every voice, especially those usually drowned out by noise. For Barron, the experience enriched his own perspective on leadership. He had always believed in the power of restraint, that speaking less and absorbing more could transform even the most intractable problems. Here was living proof that the approach scaled beyond personal debates or corporate maneuvers; it could heal entire communities. Time and time again, the scenes returned to his mind, the auditorium, filled with hundreds of citizens who had once been ready to fight, yet ended up listening so deeply that they found common ground. It was, in its own quiet way, a triumph of the human spirit. The final takeaway from that chapter in Barron Trump's life was simple yet profound: true community arises from giving each member the space to speak and to be acknowledged. Loud words often bury truth under emotional debris, while quiet, intentional dialogue unearths solutions once deemed impossible. He realized that people, when gifted with respect, could harness empathy toward constructive ends, bridging chasms that once seemed too wide. And so the lessons carried on: not every conflict ends happily, not every argument can be resolved by mere conversation, but the city's story proved that listening is a skill too often underestimated, far more powerful than its modest reputation suggests. Sometimes, a moment of silence is all it takes to remind us that we share more than we differ, and that the beating heart of a community, like that of a single individual, longs to be heard.